All right, so what is Capital Projects Fund? You may have heard of it called that, or CPF is the abbreviation for it. Well, the Capital Projects Fund is run by the Department of Treasury, and it came out of the American Rescue Plan. So if you remember back in 21, the American Rescue Plan was COVID money, COVID relief funding. And this is important because that where the money comes from determines what the rules of that program are and how the program operates. So the grants have been allocated through the Department of Treasury, through the Capital Projects Fund, to states, territories, and tribal governments. Okay, well, what is it for? It is $10 billion for grants for sustainability and improving access, infrastructure, and connectivity in areas that are of critical need. So again, this is COVID money. So the critical areas of need during the pandemic that were highlighted, that's the purpose of this funding. So that's going to be what the funding is going to be intended to use for. This capital projects program is similar to BEAD in that the money is going from a federal agency down to the state, down to the subrecipients, like internet service providers or like yourselves on this call potentially. So that's the flow of the funding. And so the way I see it is capital projects is kind of a practice round for BEAD. It's a quarter of the funding, but it is going to flow in a very similar manner. So when is Capital Projects Fund happening? It's happening right now. So this is why we are having this webinar today. Allocations have been made to the states, territories, and tribes, and some programs began late last year. Some are starting and open right now, and some will continue to open, and we will see programs coming out of this in the next few months and into early mid 23. So in July, just a little bit of background, in July, the Department of Treasury is when they started giving allocations to states and giving approvals to states' plans. And every month since July, a few more states trickle out with receiving their allocations. And so we just keep seeing more and more action happening with this funding and seeing where it's going. So the Capital Projects Fund program has a few requirements. Like I said, it comes out of the American Rescue Plan. So therefore, there are 3 different categories that it has to hit in order to, meet the critical need of the community. The project that comes out of Capital Projects Fund must provide healthcare like telehealth or any sort of virtual healthcare solutions, as well as education, remote learning, higher education, those types of things, and as well as work opportunities, working from home, searching for jobs, economic development type things for a community. And in order for a Capital Projects Fund project to work, it must meet all 3 of those criteria. And this need was, caused and exacerbated by the pandemic, hence why it came from the American Rescue Plan. And so, a project that comes out of Capital Projects Fund and uses those federal dollars must enable all 3 types of that access. So, is it really broadband funding? It has to meet all 3 of those criteria, and it's coming from the Department of Treasury. Typically, broadband funding comes from the NTIA or the FCC or the USDA. Those are, the typical deploying broadband dollars agencies. This is a little different, but yes, it is still broadband funding, and it does cover a, broader scope, and the goals and requirements may be a little bit different, but broadband infrastructure deployment actually hits all 3 of those buckets pretty easily. So what we're seeing from states is states are using those funds to create grant programs simply for broadband infrastructure, because if you build broadband infrastructure, you hit all the buckets, you hit all the program requirements, and then they can, use those funds to better the community. So that's why the Department of Treasury did anticipate that a lot of these funds would be used for broadband infrastructure. And how the states use these funds is up to the state. The Department of Treasury writes the base rules that the states then must follow, but the states get to choose how they run their programs. And the states get to create their plans. So in 21, the Department of Treasury set out the rules. They made their allocation announcements. And then in 22, the states worked on their plans. And like I said, in July is when they started approving those plans, and then they've been approving a state or 2 or 3 or 4 each month. And the state gets to decide and choose how they use their funds and how much of those funds they get to use. And we'll see that in an example in a little bit. They just have to make sure that they meet the program rules, and the states had to create these plans that then therefore had to be approved by the Department of Treasury. And so, the bottom line is it is not only, the use of funds, but, broadband deployment is going to be the dominant use. They could do other projects and other things, but broadband funding or broadband infrastructure seems to be the main use of the funds. So what are the broadband requirements? If you're going to be applying to a grant as a subrecipient in your state, what are the requirements for CPF? Well, you have to provide 100 over 100 symmetrical service to the home or business or community anchor institution. And these projects must address affordability as a part of the access. Affordability is a key piece. So you need to participate in the FCC ACP program, which provides subscribers with a monthly discount on their broadband bill. And so you would have to participate in that in order to provide affordability to your customers. You also must comply with the NDAA, and we'll talk about what that is here in the next slide, but it's the National Defense Authorization Act. And there's a couple of other compliance pieces that you'll have to comply with as you're applying and participating in these programs, like the NEPA, environmental regulations, and strong labor practices, things like that. But I do want to take a moment to talk about the speed requirement, because the rules do say that 100 over 100 service is required, but that may be expensive or challenging to do in some certain environments, and they recognize that. So there is the caveat that you could provide service of 100 over 20 with the ability to scale to 100 over 100. So, if you are a wireless provider or some other, sort of technology that can provide 100 over 20, you need to explain how that 100 over 20 service is a better use of tax funds and taxpayer dollars. And you will, have to demonstrate that you can scale to 100 over 100 in the future. So with that might mean demonstrating you can, upgrade your equipment, X, Y, or Z equipment to provide faster speeds in the future, demonstrate that the wireless industry is ever evolving, and that, it just doesn't make sense to provide fiber to every single home in this area. It's not a good use of funds, and that you can do it in another way that may be faster, more affordable, and you can, be creative, but also be factual in the sense that, if you access additional equipment or access additional spectrum, that you can provide faster speeds for your subscribers in the future. And so here's our 3 of the federal standards that are required by the rules that you would need to comply with if you are going to participate in your state capital projects fund program. So like I said, the NDAA it sounds a little scary because it's, national security regulations and act, but there is a list, and there's a hyperlink here on this slideshow. So when you get the PDF of these slides, you can click on that link, and it will take you out to a list of equipment and services that are considered to pose an unacceptable risk to our national security, and you may not purchase or have any of that equipment or services in your network or use federal funds to buy that equipment. So this is, Huawei and ZTE type equipment that you just can't have on your build, and you don't want to purchase from that list of vendors that's included there. And another aspect is BABA, the Build America, Buy America. And so this is a requirement for BEAD, but for capital projects fund, it is not required unless you're in the DC area. And so they don't require it, but they still expect programs and projects to demonstrate strong labor standards. They still want you to show evidence that you're going to be providing local community jobs, and that you're going to be holding those, the work that you're doing for your project are going to be held to a high standard. Then there's also the NEPA and environmental laws that you will have to comply with and think about as you are applying. So this is, if your project is going to be in a floodplain or an area that's at risk for forest fires or in a path of bird migration or endangered species, anything to do with the environment, whether you're digging or you're not, you're still going to need to evaluate this, maybe provide a narrative, maybe answer a few questions that have to do with the environment. Some of these are pretty basic, but if you're in an area with a lot of environmental challenges, then a deeper review might be required. So, some of this you might be able to do on your own. Some of it you may need to consult with an environmental expert. If you don't have one or don't know one, reach out. We can make a recommendation and help you out there. But those are sort of the three major buckets of federal standards to keep in mind if you're applying to any of these programs. And here's another interesting component of the CPF program is that you can use CPF funds to complement another project. So it doesn't necessarily disqualify a project from using other governmental funds, but they like to see, complementary. You can't double dip and reuse the funds for the same project. Using, two different funding sources for one project is a big no-no. But what you can do is use two different funds to maximize your area, to maximize your build, to maximize your speed. You can use funds as matching funds for another program as long as the project qualifies for both program rules. So ARPA and SLFRF, which is the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, which is also COVID money, those can be used as matching funds for BEAD. So it's interesting, but we haven't really, and it could be potentially useful as well if you're looking at BEAD and looking for a matching source. The challenge that I see is we haven't actually seen a use case done for this yet, and states are typically using their capital projects fund to set up an infrastructure grant program. If you apply to your state and you say you're just going to you want to apply for matching funds for BEAD, technically it's allowable. But are they actually going to give you that money as opposed to another provider who actually wants to connect homes and businesses? Probably not. Their priority really is to connect people, and they will get into this, but they're going to have to report on those numbers, how many homes and businesses that they are connecting along the way. And they have to, submit to the Department of Treasury that they're following their plan. So it's interesting. And then, if you were to go about this route of using these funds to use as match, it's important to know that you must fulfill both capital projects fund requirements as well as the other program fund requirements and goals and meet those standards. So it's kind of silly, like, Brooke, why are you telling us this? Does it even matter? Well, some states haven't fully used their 100% of their capital projects fund yet or disclosed how they're going to use it. So there is still a potential that some states have, 30 to 70% left of this funding. They could set it aside for a potential match opportunity. Like I said, we haven't seen it yet, but it is a possibility. And states could do something else besides broadband infrastructure grants with this money. They could use the match like we're talking about here. They could also do digital connectivity technology projects where they provide devices at public facilities for the community to access public Wi-Fi, laptops, PCs for work, for education, and telehealth, because that marks all three of the buckets that are required for the program. They could also use the funding to build multi-purpose community facilities that provide community school, education, internet access. You could think libraries or health centers to provide telehealth services. So I know a lot of you are just in this industry and you may have partners or connections or communities that might need these services. So just want everyone to be aware that broadband infrastructure grants is not the only path that this funding can be used for. And it remains to be seen if the other states will use these funds in different ways. So we just wanted to show that there's different opportunities that can be used for this fund. And it may be appealing, to try to get this public funding as a match. But from what we have seen so far, the states are really going to want to see private funding match come in when you're applying to either a CPF program or BEAD or any sort of state broadband grant program. Is They really want to see you bringing in a contribution and bringing in skin to the game. So how the Capital Projects Fund is structured is this is a good visual for us to see. The program has federal funds from the Department of Treasury. Those have been allocated to the states, territories, and the tribes. And then the states, territories, and tribes then create programs according to those federal rules from the Department of Treasury. And then eligible entities like yourselves, internet service providers, anyone who's applying to these funds and is eligible, create those projects to then therefore use the funds. And I just want to highlight again, this is very similar to how the BEAD program will be rolling out here later this year and into early 24. So I guess get used to it. And so here is a slide to outline how the funding has been distributed and allocated. So they had 10 billion like we discussed in the beginning. And so first off, tribal governments, each tribe must receive at least $50,000. The Hawaiian tribal entities could receive up to $200,000. And so the way the math works out is each tribe was essentially allocated $167,000 for each tribe. And then the territories and freely associated states were allocated 100 million paid in equal shares. So they had to divide that equally between all the territories. What that came down to is that they have each been allocated about 14 million. And then finally, the big 9.8 billion that got divided between the states, Puerto Rico, and DC were determined on a formula. And so out of that 9.8 billion, 50% of that funding was distributed based on population for that state. 25% was distributed based on rurality. And then the other remaining 25% was based on poverty numbers. And so that gave a formula for a dollar amount that each state was allocated. If you want to know what your state was allocated, there is a spreadsheet for that. The Department of Treasury released that data with specific numbers on what each state was allocated and what that amount is. So then next in the process, the states took those allocated amounts and they wrote a plan for how they want to utilize those funds. Those plans had to be reviewed and approved by the Department of Treasury. Some of them are still under review with the Department of Treasury. And some states have only requested a percentage of their funds for now, and they might request the remaining percentage later. That remains to be seen. And so here we wanted to give you a little flavor of a few examples of how the Capital Projects Fund money has been rolling out and what we've seen as examples from various states. Like I've said, all the programs must adhere to the Department of Treasury standards, but each program is going to be tailored to that specific state's needs and priorities that state outlined in their state plan. Many grants will be competitive, but the state does have the option to do a reverse auction or divide the money via a formula. So the state has a little bit of flexibility, but we've seen generally a competitive grant situation is how the states are handling it. And also eligible entities and locations will be determined, by the state on how they want to prioritize the funds. We've been seeing generally that anything below 100/20 is an eligible area for funding. They might prioritize areas that are below 25/3 to try to really get those unserved areas. But that's, generally the trend that we've been seeing. And so let's take a look at Louisiana. So Louisiana was allocated 176 million, and they asked for 100% of their funds in their plan. And that was, given to them by the Department of Treasury. And so their focus has been on trying to provide access to those at 25/3 or below. And their program that they use these funds for is one of my favorite government acronyms, the GUMBO program. And so I did actually look it up. The GUMBO program does stand for something. It stands for Granting Unserved Municipalities Broadband Opportunities, which is a mouthful. So they have nicely abbreviated it to the GUMBO program. But this is a multi-phase competitive grant program utilizing these CPF funds for broadband infrastructure projects. And so that program had an application round in 2022 It is multi-phase, so we anticipate that one may open up again, but that announcement remains to be seen. So, we can continue on to New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a different example because they've only asked for 41% of their allocation, which is 50 million. And their focus is a little bit different, rural and remote areas. You can see they just define things a little differently at each state. And New Hampshire used these funds for the Broadband Contract Program, which selects and supports local ISPs for building, broadband access projects. And I believe New Hampshire is the one that is doing a reverse auction. So they want the cheapest project that is out there, and they are, looking for the one that, maximizes the use of the federal dollar. And so that's a different approach, as a grant is a different avenue than a reverse auction. RDOF is another example of a reverse auction program where they want the lowest bid for a project and they're going to pick the lowest number. So it's just a different, every state has a different preference on how they're rolling out these programs. Virginia is another state that's got 100% of their allocation, which is $219 million, and that is for last mile broadband through the VATI program, which were competitive grants for local governments that partnered with ISPs. So Virginia has also a different twist on things, that they require and want partnership with local governments. You've probably seen on a lot of programs that partnerships with municipalities and that public-private partnership is very encouraged. Well, in Virginia, it's required. So it's important to know and understand the rules of your state, to know what is required and what is needed and what is recommended or suggested. And then finally in Maine, they received 86% of their allocation for expanding existing and new networks through the Connect Ready program, which is also a competitive grant program. And it was for broadband line extensions. So you're seeing hopefully a trend that each state can choose how they want to distribute these funds, if they want all the funds or not. And what could happen is New Hampshire might come back and ask for their remaining percentage of funds. Same with Maine, but that just remains to be seen. And we have one last more specific example is Arkansas. So Arkansas had its goals of providing high-speed internet access in rural and remote areas, kind of seeing a trend at how these funds are being distributed and where they're intended to go. This is through the Arkansas Rural Connect, or the ARC program, which was $47 million in competitive grants. And they wanted to focus on rural and disadvantaged locations without reliable internet of 100 over 20. So you can see it is going to be important looking at your state how they define unserved and underserved. It's going to vary from state to state on their definitions, and it is going to vary what areas would be eligible for a grant and for funding. So in Arkansas, if you're below 100 over 20, you would be eligible, but maybe not in Louisiana because their definitions are a bit different. And so this ARC program used 30% of Arkansas's funds, and they have some additional funds that they can request later to expand on this program. They want to just refuel and put more money in it, or they could create or design different capital projects fund programs. So here's sort of a timeline on the program and how things are happening. You can see the picture, the timelines are all over the place, because that's really how this program has come out, is all the timelines are all over the place. Every state is different. Every state has a different timeline, but there are a few set in stone timelines that the states and the Department of Treasury have to follow. So in Q2 and right now and in early 23 is when applications are opening up for subgrants. This is why we're having this webinar today, to make everyone aware of this program and aware that programs are happening in your states. And if they aren't happening right now, either they happened last year or they are going to happen again in early 23. So it's important to just be top of mind and be aware. Some other interesting dates are that all funds must be obligated by the end of 24. So they must be set aside, put in an area, put in a budget. The state must, have a plan and know where that funding is going to go. And then the implementation period is going to be from 23 to 26 of when the project is going to be implemented. So all funds must be expended, meaning they must be spent by December 31st of 2026. Right now, it may not seem, okay, it's in 26, it's a few years away, that's fine. But really, with broadband construction and building these types of projects, that is a very, very short timeline to be able to get a major broadband infrastructure program built and out there. And so if you do win an award through Capital Projects Fund, it's important to plan for this and plan that all of your funding and all of your monies from your grant need to be spent by the end of 26. That doesn't necessarily mean your build has to be done by that date, technically, but realistically, you're really going to want to plan for being done by that date, because any final costs that you have that go into 27 are not going to be reimbursable or covered, and you're going to have to cover them out of your own pocket. We also know from past experience that when you finish your project, you're going to have to do a final closeout report. The Department of Treasury could potentially audit you and audit, all of your finances and everything that you've spent on the grant. And so any of that work, you're going to want to be done in 26 so that it can be reimbursed and covered with your grant funds. Anything it happens in 27, like I said, won't be reimbursable. So you really need to just plan for this deadline. So if it were me, I would feel super anxious and, okay, I need to go out and buy materials right now so that I can have them stacked in my warehouse and ready to go and ready to build. Please don't do that. If you buy anything that you buy or purchase prior to a grant agreement being signed with your state, won't be reimbursed or covered under the grant. So although it is proactive to try to, get on top of supply chain and get on top of having everything in your warehouse and at your fingertips ready to go, it's not necessarily a good thing in the eyes of funding, because those costs won't be a covered expense. So what does this mean? Well, we recommend you have a shovel-ready plan that is really thought out. You know what permits you're going to need, what easements you're going to go to, you really plan where you're going to build, and you don't, you get everything, all of your ducks in a row, so that once you sign that grant agreement, you can start construction, because you will have, I'm estimating 2 years. I know it says 3 years in the slide, but I know how long it takes these. The application period is 3 months. The state's going to take 3 to 6 months to review your application. It's going to take a month to get a grant agreement signed, by everyone who's necessary and agreed upon. So realistically, you're going to have, in my opinion, about 2 years to build and construct a complete broadband infrastructure project, which isn't a lot of time. So just making sure that you're shovel ready, you have all of your ducks in a row, and are ready to start building as soon as those funds get allocated. And so we're finishing up here on our capital projects fund, but we wanted to take a minute to talk about reporting, because states are going to be required to report on these funds and these projects and how their plan is coming to fruition to the Department of Treasury. Well, what that means for you is that you as an applicant are going to have to report to the state what is happening, how you're spending your money, and things like that. So the states have reporting requirements, as well as anyone who wins the funding. And there is an outline through the Department of Treasury as a basis of what the states have to report, and that's what you see here on the screen. The state that you win funding with will need this data at a minimum, but they could also request more, so they need more to report, on their specific plan or something like that. So these are the minimum requirements for reporting. The government, essentially wants to see every single penny that is being spent with grant funds, because you're spending taxpayer dollars and they want to know where everything is going. So you have to show them all of your expenditures. This will include documentation, POs, quotes, invoices, narratives, and cover letters, things like that. They're going to want to know where in your budget those funds are coming from. So which budget category you're spending different, funds on. They're going to want to know your project status, any sort of timelines or milestones that you've set if you're meeting them, what the community benefits are, who is, benefiting from your project, and what are they specifically benefiting from. They may ask some program-specific data like the number of households, the number of schools, the number of businesses or community anchor institutions that you are connecting. They're going to want to know some technical data on what speeds and these recipients have access to, who's actually signed up, who's actually connected, who is live, who is on your network. Like I mentioned there, since there are strong labor standards that are required with these program rules, you're going to have to prove this throughout the process of showing and documenting that those strong labor practices that you plan for are actually being implemented. And then, annually you'll have these other performance requirements that you'll have to report on outcomes compared to the objectives that the state has put forth in their state plan. And so just want to put a plug in there that Widelity can help with this. This is what we do. This is our bread and butter, and why we have 70 staff members on hand to do these reporting and documentation requirements. And the good thing is that this cost of doing this administrative grant management type work is typically covered during for your grant, as long as you put a line item in your budget. So it's important that when you're in the application phase, that you put a line item in your budget for reporting, for compliance, for grant management type support, so that you can get those costs reimbursed and covered. So Widelity, we can help with both the application phase in submitting your application, as well as this post-award reporting support. And if you do decide to do your application on your own, that is great and wonderful. And if you would like a quote or a proposal of pricing for the post-award work, just reach out to me and be happy to provide that, so that you can put that line item in your budget as you're getting prepared for your application. So what do we do now? We talked a lot about the Capital Projects Fund and all of the different requirements and the timeline and how things are happening now. And it's time to be prepared now and get my plans in place. So what do I do? Well, first step would be to learn, see what is going on in your state. Educate yourself on your state broadband office, what their priorities are, what their requirements are, if they have an open program right now, or maybe in a few months. And just sort of see and try to help yourself plan and be prepared for when an application does come. And if that is something you don't have staff or time for, reach out to me. We'd be happy to provide you with a brief overview of what's going on in your state. And then the second step that we recommend is to locate. Use various tools to determine where your eligible project areas could be. Look at where your current network is and how you can expand upon that network, and which areas would be eligible for a potential grant. And start making those build plans now, regardless of where your state is at in the process. You can utilize a lot of different tools, like if you have a state broadband map, that would probably be your most accurate tool to use. And you can also use the new FCC Fabric Map. And in that Fabric Map, I recommend on the little settings toggle to view anything that is below 100/20 and anything that is terrestrial. And that will help you see areas that are typically eligible for this grant funding. And then finally is to prepare. Start gathering your documentation. The biggest thing with these grants is the financials. Financials can sometimes take a bit of time to get together, so that is something that you can start preparing now. Audited financials are not required with this program, but some states we are seeing are preferring them. So if you have audited financials, that would be the preferred method of financials. If you don't, alternatively, you could use reviewed financials. And they typically want to see the last 2 to 3 years of your financial statements. And the purpose of that is to show that your company has financial viability and that your company can handle $1 million in grant funds to be able to spend them responsibly and commit to the project, meet your deadlines, and all of that. It's to ensure that the taxpayer dollars get spent in a wise manner. And the other thing you can work on now is preparing your budget. Looking, using the map that you create, start preparing a budget, start creating those budget timelines. Also your project timeline. As we talked about, it's only going to be about a 2, maybe 3 year window for you to do this build. You're really going to need to be intentional on that timeline in order to get your project done. And you're going to need to show to the state that you are ready to start building the minute you start getting those funds, and really have that timeline and that project management plan built out so that you're ready to go and get those shovel ready projects. And so with that, if you need help, we are here to help. This is what we do. And we talk to clients about these different opportunities and grants and reporting requirements all day long. And so these are, sort of our two buckets of services. Our consulting is we can help you identify which program is best for your company and for what you want to do. We can help you choose eligible service areas and help you, prepare that documentation and be your guide throughout the process. And for our compliance services, we offer grant writing to help you apply. We help with compliance consulting and that reimbursement and reporting services as you win a grant, that post-award support. So we are here for you and with you from start to finish, from the entire grant process. And so finally, again, we will send this out in a PDF form, and these are live links. So if you want to meet with me and talk to me about your specific states and what sort of funding opportunities you may have, you can click this link here and it will bring you to my calendar, so you can just pick a time that works for you. You can also click here to follow our upcoming events. I will be out on the road and at a lot of shows this year, so I'd be happy to see you and meet with you live and in person. And then finally, you can click this bottom link to explore our site, where we have a capital projects fund. We call it a PIP, a program information PDF. So basically it's a rundown of this entire presentation in about 10 pages, and details, the entire program in a different format. If you want to download that, you're more than welcome to. And so with that, I will hand it over to Caitlin to see if there's any questions.
Alrighty, one moment. Okay, so the first question is, what are some examples of in-kind matching funds?
Yeah, so for matching for broadband grant programs, typically they want to see either cash matching options or in-kind. In-kind matching options can be assets that the company has. They can be donated equipment or services that you may have. Any sort of assets that you have for the project can be utilized. They could be long-term leases. They could be potentially personnel costs. And it is going to depend on the rules of the state. Every state is going to outline their different requirements for matching funds a little differently, but you can think of in-kind matching funds as any sort of asset that you're bringing to the project or to the table that is not going to be covered by the grant funds. Another example could be poles. If you already have existing poles, that could be seen as an asset because you're going to be utilizing those poles for your project, and you can bring that cost of those poles to the table as an in-kind match.
And another question is, how do I know if the Capital Projects Fund program is open in my state?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. So you can go out there and research your state broadband office and see which programs are open and live, and if they have any information on their broadband website. Or you can reach out to us if you don't have the time to fiddle with all of that. We would be happy to take a look at your state. My team has probably researched all 50 states at this point, and we have at least a little bit of information on all the states. And with that, I will put a plug out there that in April, we're going to be launching a tool that can be it's going to be a subscription service that you can subscribe to and gain access to our curated research for states that may be of interest for you. If you want to know what's going on in the state, know when an application deadline is dropping, be notified of when that application goes live, and kind of get monthly updates. We're providing a subscription service to anyone who's interested, and that will go live in mid-April. And so I guess that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you everyone for joining, and hope to meet with you all out there soon. Thanks, everybody.